Good evening. Welcome to Kitchissippi United Church. Oh my gosh, I tell people not to hit these all the time, and I just did. Very delighted to welcome you here this evening. My name is Reverend Jenny Leslie, and this is Reverend Brian Cornelius. I'm the minister here, and I'm very glad you're here. And the bathrooms are just outside these doors. That's important to know. Please feel free to help yourself to more goodies and warm drinks.
It's a delight to be co-hosting this event with Kitchissippi, First United in Kitchissippi, and for all of you who have made it here this evening. Just a reminder, there are refreshments at the back, and so take advantage of them. Don't want to take too many of them home, so it'd be great if you ate them. And then secondly, we're really delighted to have Spaniel's Tale here. And Spaniel's Tale is an independent bookstore in Hintonburg, right at the corner of sort of Roosevelt and Wellington there. And so they actually have copies of the book. And so if you've been intending to purchase the book, you can go and do that. And I know I've got my book all ready to go because I always make notes and my pen's ready and everything. And so that's just available here. And Stephen is here from Spaniel's Tale, and we're really glad that they've been able to come. We also want to thank the volunteers. Why don't you do that?
Yeah. I'd like to thank the Kitchissippi volunteers who continue to walk by with kettles and stuff that are for warm drinks for you. Thank you to Nancy and David, Denise and Lori Jo, and all the tech team that we have here tonight as well. Thanks all.
So we're going to get the show on the road, and it's important that we've invited Jamie Scott to come and do an introduction to Heather. And Jamie had opportunity to look at the book as it was being formed. And so it's a delight to welcome Jamie Scott, who is presently retired and attending First United and was very involved as the official officer for the United Church of Canada on residential schools. And so it's a delight to welcome Jamie to come and introduce Heather, and then we'll let her do her thing. Yes. After, we'll do the land acknowledgement and then Jamie.
Okay, very good. Kitchissippi acknowledges that we are on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, and we are doing our best to look into ways that we can be active at reconciliation. So we're happy to be here. Happy to have you here.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the opportunity to introduce Heather. Coincidentally, this happens to be my birthday, but I don't think that that's why you're here tonight, is that? Thank you. We've gathered here because we want to hear from a very accomplished woman who has just released a poignant memoir of how she personally has engaged in the reconciliation process. I first met Heather Menzies about 20 years ago when she was attending First United, and I was going there as well. She was an active member and at one point even chaired the church council. But I knew beyond that she was also an activist in the women's movement, and we shared a common passion for social justice. Since then, I've learned much more about her. Heather is a multi-talented journalist, writer, speaker, commentator, lecturer, board member, health advocate, and filmmaker. She has 10 books to her credit, 2 of which have been included in the Globe and Mail's annual Books to Read. She has written numerous articles, columns, and academic papers, and she has produced and directed a video series and a documentary film. In her spare time, she serves as the adjunct professor in the Department of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University and is a recognized leader and thinker on how digital technologies are changing our world, particularly for women. Over her career, her work has been regularly recognized with the Ottawa Book Award, an honorary doctorate from Concordia University, and an Ottawa Distinguished Woman Award. She was also appointed to the Order of Canada in 2013 for her contributions to public discourse. Living now on Gabrielle Island in BC, Heather has recently focused on what is needed to effect healing and reconciliation between settler and the First Peoples of this land. Her last book, Our Long Struggle for Home, the Ipwash story, was a collaboration with the Nisga'a people of Stony Point in their telling their story. That experience of engaging with them led her to insights as to what treaty kin means and what reconciliation must entail. What Heather describes as a personal act of atonement, an opportunity for me to heal myself and repair myself. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission produced its final report in 2008, the chair, Justice Mary Sinclair, spoke these words: "We have described for you a mountain. We have shown you the path to the top. We call upon you to do the climbing." Friends, Heather Menzies has done the climbing. I was privileged to be asked by Heather to read a pre-published edition of her, or version of her book, and I offered these words as an endorsement, words that are now printed on the back jacket. Heather Menzies courageously and humbly chronicles her personal journey of disrupting the colonial legacy through unlearning and deep listening to her treaty kin. Her story offers wisdom for going beyond words of apology to rebuild respectful relations with First Peoples. This is hard work. There is hard work in this journey, but there is also hope. It is my distinct honor to introduce Heather Menzies.
Wow. Thank you, Jamie. Jamie Scott is a man I have admired for years. He walked humbly and honorably in representing the United Church in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, and he continues that walk. And I am very proud to be walking beside him. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight among not only friends, but family. I feel very held by your love and your support and your presence. Thank you. Not very long ago, like so many people I know, I was kind of stalled in the starting gate of reconciliation. All those land acknowledgements had gotten rather repetitive. And buying and wearing an orange t-shirt, well, we all know you can't buy reconciliation. But I didn't know how to step further. I'd never even been on an Indian reserve, which is how I understood to call them when I was a kid growing up. At best, I'd driven through a few, going somewhere else. Until 2018, when my destination was a reserve in Anishinaabe territory in southwest Ontario, the Stony Point Reserve. I want to read you a little bit from the prologue. November 2018. On a cool gray day in late autumn, I stood outside the former Ipwash Army Barracks where Cully George Mandika has lived since 1995, the year her brother Dudley was shot by the Ontario Provincial Police. There were 200 years of social, cultural, and political alienation between the woman on the other side of the door and me. Yet somehow, according to Indigenous ways of thinking about which I was starting to learn, this woman and I were related, as was Dudley, by a treaty. We were even treaty kin. I knocked on the door, my mouth dry, my heart thumping in my chest. I waited. my eyes on the small square window set in the faded wooden door. The curtain moved. I stood there waiting, feeling conspicuous as a pickup truck drove by on the road just beyond where I stood, slowing down as it passed. Someone had noticed me. I felt conspicuous, clearly a white person, Shaganash, on this remnant of ancient Anishinaabe territory. I continued to stand there, not wanting to knock again, but not wanting to give up either. The door opened a few inches. In the darkness of the opening, I saw a short woman, brown skin, dark brown eyes, chin-length gray hair. "Yes," she said, her voice hard. I told her my name. I knew it was pretty late, I said, but I'd come to offer her my condolences at the death of her brother. She looked at me hard. I held her gaze. Brown eyes on blue, blue eyes on brown. She stepped back, pulled open the door. "Come in," she said. That was the beginning. I had come to that spot, to that reserve, because in 1827 a treaty was formed with Anishinaabe, had legitimized my great-great-grandparents settling in Anishinaabe territory, in this part of southwestern Ontario, in 1832. That same treaty had set aside large tracts of land as for the exclusive use of the Anishinaabe in perpetuity. One of these was the Stony Point Reserve. They called it Ajudena. 1942, the federal government invoked the War Measures Act to appropriate the entire reserve and turned it into an army training camp they called Ipwash. They said to the people, "We'll return the land after the war." What they wrote into the Order of Council was, when the military no longer needs the land. Well, after the war, they turned it into a cadet training camp and kept it going and going and going. And the people, the elders in particular, were writing letters, writing petitions. And then finally, got to the 1990s, they were getting old. The ones who'd been born there and raised there, had memories of that's their place of belonging, said, we're going home. And we don't care if they're shooting at us, we're going home. And it was that return that ultimately led in 1995, in September of 1995, to the police shooting death of Dudley George. And I learned all about this because I was beginning to implicate myself. I was beginning to learn what treaties are all about from an Indigenous point of view. And they're all about the sharing of land and sharing responsibility for land. And then the responsibility to keep that treaty relationship in good repair is passed down from generation to generation. So I thought, that's me, my generation. What are my responsibilities to this broken treaty? At this point, why don't we take a look at some slides that I brought, because then it gives you a sense of where I arrived to. And what I'll do is I just sort of say the next slide or whatever. So if we could get the first slide. What I've done here, and I couldn't resist it, there's a two-row, you're looking at a two-row wall in Pom Belt in very great disrepair, and that makes, I think it's very fitting because the treaties are broken, and so to see a broken wampum belt is very fitting. But the wampum belt dates back to the 1630s, and it was one of the most recurring wampum images in treaty making between the indigenous people of Turtle Island and the newcomers. And it represented basically two sovereign, self-determining peoples going side by side, each in their own vehicle. So the birch bark canoe and one, and the British sailing ships and the other, but going down the same shared path, the river of life, together. I put that over the top of, and to my mind that represents the kind of potential of the treaty side of our heritage as settlers. What I put it over the top of is a map of Ipwash, showing and it doesn't show very well, but it's the mortar range, the range where they would be firing grenades and mortars and this sort of thing for target practice. And to my mind, this sort of somehow represents what colonialism has been about and how much it's denied the realities of the two-row Pom Belt. The next picture is, I took this because I was just wandering around when I was given permission to sort of do so. And this is one of the signs that the Anishinaabe put up when they went back in the 1990s. That sign has since been taken down. Next slide shows the other side of what I encountered. These signs are all over on the fence posts. It was one of the first visual images that I encountered when I got to Stony Point or Ipwash, because the debris of the Army training camp is still there. The place is riddled with unexploded ordnances, which are now in the process slowly of being cleaned up. Next slide will show sort of just what the land's like. And there's both you can see the debris from the army, just all kinds of garbage left over, but you can also see the resurgence of life coming back, plants growing, etc. So there's a hopeful bit. Next slide shows, this is just again, I wanted to show this because that sign was put up in the 1990s. And you can see how faded it is. And they still haven't regained the right to call the place Ajudana, because they haven't regained full control of it. The next slide, this is just thought I'd put that in because this is a memorial that they put up for Dudley George, basically on the spot where he was felled by an OPP bullet. And every September 6th there is a memorial. People come, they put their tobacco down, and remember, and the spirit of Dudley is there. Next slide. This is a bit of a depressing sign because this building was built in 1993 through a collective labor and donations from unions like the auto workers, the hydro workers. There were lots of unions supported this, and that was quite beautiful. This was a council hall that they built, and where they were reviving their own self-governance traditions. There was a lot of revival of ceremony, sweat lodges, and this sort of thing. But you can see right now the state it's in. And to my mind, again, it's the promise of reclaiming that land has not fully been fulfilled. So this is a sign of the neglect that has been allowed to happen. Next slide. This shows the peace tree. That was a little seedling that they planted in 1993, under which they buried the hatchet. And they literally did bury a war pipe, which has a hatchet on it, as well as the smoking pipe thing, and it's black. They buried that as their commitment to nonviolence. They said, we will not have any weapons here. And they remained unarmed. So you can see how tall that tree is. Many people come and put tobacco ties on that tree. I did, more than once. Next slide. This shows the barracks where some of them are still living. So I read about where Cully is. This is the front door of her barracks. But 2 people are still living in the barracks. Because the elders, when they led the way home in 1993, said, you have to stay there until the federal government has absolutely returned control. And they haven't yet. I write about that in the memoir, because of course this is retelling my whole journey of learning through the lens of my experience of all that I had to confront in order to do that learning. Next slide. It starts to introduce you to the people. So here's Cully, and this is what I walked into when she said, come in. And there's a plastic Tiffany lamp with bingo cards hanging below it. And Cully is working on bear paw quilt. Next slide. That's her. And next slide. This is another of the people. There were 4 people I worked with. One of them is Marcia Simon. Next slide. That's Marcia, and on the left is her son, Kevin, who also became one of the co-authors of the book. He was 16 in 1993 and went home, and he hasn't left. He's been working to regain his homeland ever since, and he's 42 years old now. Next is Bonnie, and she's holding a copy of the finished book, Our Long Struggle for Home. I've got a copy with me if anyone wants to look at it. So I met these people. It was kind of one person introduced me to another. We can turn that off anytime you want. One person introduced me to another, and I think Bonnie was a big factor in suddenly there I was, sort of in a meeting, and they said, you know, we've been hoping someone with journalistic skills might show up and help us write our story. And then they looked at me. And so I was so full of confidence and so full of excitement. Treaty kin, my goodness, I could become Treaty kin and craning here if I take this. So yes, no self-doubts. And I thought, wow, it's a get out of jail free card in Monopoly. You know, I could leave all this messy colonial baggage at the door and just be straight into this treaty kinship relationship. Well, no, because that colonial baggage was right here. Colonial and white superiority thinking was stitched into how I thought, how I talked, how I walked into a room. So here I am talking to Marcia, and she's telling me about life on the reserve, and I say, well, you carried on being traditional. And she snorted and she said, we weren't being traditional. We were just being normal, being human. And I thought, yeah, right. And there I was, putting her in a little historical box and boxing out the fullness of her humanity. Another example, again with Marcia, we taped for 2.5 hours her telling lots of the stories from 1993 to 1994 into 1995, and then she spoke of the very hard moments of that night when Dudley George was killed, because her son Kevin was right beside Dudley at the time. And she remembered her saying, whenever I talk about Dudley, a great big sob goes off inside me. And then, you know, we paused, and then we kind of went on, and we were winding down because we'd had enough talking for the day. But then she was talking about, but Kevin, there he is, still there, carrying on. And I said, the occupation. And again she said, no, an occupation. If you occupy something, you go home afterwards. We were home. This is our homeland. And it made me realize how much the power dynamics of colonialism just keeps working. And in the book, I likened it to almost like a gravitational force field, pulling me into a position where I just automatically assumed the role of interpreting reality, putting frames around things, but taking stuff that was new to me and putting it in terms that were familiar to me. And I realized how important it was for me to resist that. And I did so by focusing on them. So I would pay attention to that tightening of the lips, the silence, and I knew enough to interpret that as a withholding of trust, that I could be trusted to really be hearing and heeding what they were saying. So I had to work at disrupting myself, interrupting myself, and also just shutting myself up. But it was because I began to care enough about these people that I was paying hard attention to those little cues that I was still putting my foot in it, still in those old patterns of thinking. So it was a bit of a push of my determination and a pull of the feeling tone of the relationships as they were developing between us that was making all the difference. Another story is, and I should at this point make it clear, Dudley's mother, also Cully's mother, Bonnie's mother, Marcia, the mother, and many of the fathers too, were all forced to go to the residential school. The local residential school, Mount Elgin, was run by the United Church of Canada. So one of the things I was doing was some outreach to the right relations groups around in the area, and there was one at the local church at Grand Bend. So this particular Sunday I went to the church and I met the people, and then they were telling me that it had an exhibit of photos of the children from Mount Elgin, yeah. And I said, well, are those photos still around? Is it possible to get copies? Because I thought Bonnie might be really interested in this. Because I was going to Bonnie's place for supper that night. So when I got to Bonnie's place, I was feeling pretty proud of myself. I was waiting for the right moment. I was peeling potatoes, and I just sort of said, I was at church and entered the photographs. She stopped everything. She said, I heard about that. I want to get copies. Can I get copies? I'll pay for them. And I was just kind of, wow, taken aback. But of course, people like me and probably most of you, we were like, it was news to us, these unmarked graves that were discovered at places like Kamloops, but in fact are all over the place. But people like Bonnie knew all along about the children who never came home. They're still missing, still unaccounted for, and potentially now they know, disappeared into unmarked graves. So when I went back to my motel that night, I did what I often do when I'm feeling kind of sad. I know I've got something to think about. So I lit a candle, and I will sit and I'll just look into the candle and let things be, let things just emerge. Even though I'd read about all these children's deaths, the reality of them as lived lives and part of an indivisible webwork of lived lives had remained remote until now. I stared into the candle flame, aching at that remoteness, aware too that in a way it echoed the indifference of those school officials who would do such things. Leaning toward the candle flame, I sat with that indifference and the racism in its shadow. I sat too with what Bonnie had said, the emotion of her response bursting in on me, her fierce desire to get copies of those photos. I sat there as the candle burned lower, feeling that urgency, identifying with it, making a connection. I was starting to make Bonnie's reality part of my reality, sharing it. I kept gazing at the candle flame as it flickered and held steady, flickered again and steadied itself. The boxes in my head had kept us at a distance, I realized. That jolt had been a sign of it. The difference in our perspectives, our sense of reality and what was important. But the sadness, if I dwelt on it, also signaled a crack. Every crack was helping me break out of my inner boxes, opening the space between us, filling it with empathy and the capacity for love. And slowly, because I was going there for a week, 2 weeks at a time, it took 5 years. I'm a slow learner. But it was all that unlearning. But I slowly began to be comfortable just being in the presence of these people, held in the present moment of the relationship. And it was at that moment that I'll give you one example, like at Bonnie's place, behind the front door when you come in, you know, there's sort of the little corner behind, there was a birch bark, I don't know, call it a stick or a log with red ribbons around it. And I remember the first time I was at Bonnie's place, I noticed it, but my eyes would kind of skitter away because it didn't fit in any of my familiar boxes. There was a dream catcher, and because there was so much kitsch associated with that, that didn't bother me. But it was this thing, and I remember, but that was, and that just one of the reasons why it was so important for me to get out of the center of my comfort zone and into the center of their comfort zone, where I just had to sit with my discomfort of not knowing. Sit with the powerlessness of not knowing, not being in charge, not being in control. And as that began to ebb away, the need to do that ebbed away, so I began to open, my awareness started to open to the true reality, the fullness of the reality of what was being shared with me. And I'll give you one, I want to do one more reading to give you a sense of this. The last day, this last visit when I was finishing recording, and I felt I'm ready to start writing the first draft. I've got all the material that they wanted to have included by way of historical background and this sort of thing. I've got a whole lot of these stories recorded and so on and so forth. But I wanted to have one more little recording session. And Bonnie and Fred, her husband, were the oldest of these people. And Fred was a language speaker and managed to escape being in residential school. So he had a lot of knowledge and a great deal of wisdom. And I said, what I'd like to be able to do is have more about the richness of the daily life that was interrupted when the army came and just took over your homeland. And so they told me all kinds of stories. And then they got to telling me about the medicines and how they learned medicines from watching the animals. And Fred was talking about, you know, the muskrat going after this particular thing and the moose going after this, and these are all medicines. And then he talked about how in this early spring, when the buds of the birch tree are starting to open, the birds come and they get the beginnings of the sap coming out. And so he told me that story and how they learned from the birds. And Fred leaned forward and looked out the window at the old birch tree standing on one side of the front yard. He watches for the birds every spring, he said, coming to drink the sap water from the opening buds. They come right in that old birch there, he said. That's why they're up there, getting that medicine. He turned and smiled at me. And in that instant, when our eyes met, something happened. It could have been how Fred had tilted his head so he could look out the window, connecting with a spot high up in that beautiful old birch tree where he watches for the birds returning every spring. Or it could have been the joy that seemed to radiate off his face as he evoked this seasonal ritual, this moment of kinship with a bird, seeking the sap's healing power after having endured a long winter too. A bird sharing its knowledge of this with human beings. It also could have been the fact that he was sharing this with me, letting me in on this, and all it meant to him. It was as though he was inviting me in, not just into this circle of shared knowledge, but into a kinship circle of sharing that includes muskrats and moose and birds too. I felt as though I had crossed a bridge, as though I had caught a glimpse of the other shells on the Pom Belt. Not just the purple shells representing the Anishinaabe canoes going their way separate from the white people's sailing ships, but the white shells in which those purple lines are embedded, the cosmos that hold them. I got a sense of what it was like to be stitched into that bed of white shells where the trees grow and the birds come to rest. So I moved. It was no longer a case where I was learning about Indigenous ways of being. I was being welcomed into the presence of those actively being lived. And it was as I gained that sense of the presence that I could sense the possibilities of reconciliation. To be able to honor that perspective, to be embedded in the cosmos, understood to be embedded in a webwork of relationships, where the moose and the muskrats and the birds are fellow beings along with us. And so, just to end, reconciliation on a big scale is reconciliation of two sovereigns. Sovereign, the sovereign, self-determined peoples of the Anishinaabe and the other indigenous people. So that's between governments and governments. But then there's also reconciliation at the level of where we live our lives and in the places where we work and are active. And that's the challenge of reconciling realities. And I got a sense of that's our journey towards becoming treaty kin and potentially qualifying to call ourselves treaty allies someday. Two examples of where my awareness opened up. Through the book, there's a continuous story of me chatting with one of Bonnie's granddaughters called Summer. She got a short-term contract with a local museum and archive to record elders' stories for the archives. And she shared with me, as she got to know me, some of her misgivings about kind of how they were treating these stories. And they were very eager to have them turned over and made accessible to the public and so on and so forth. And over the course of our conversations, because I'd also been involved in something representing writers, in something called the National Heritage Digitization Project, where museum people and university people and libraries, etc., were all coming together about digitizing the holdings of various cultural institutions. And they were all on access to these holdings. It gave me more of a something to work with in terms of as I was listening to Summer telling her story. And then suddenly there was this shift in my mind from holdings as a noun, to holdings as a verb. And all the relationships around that holding. So when Summer went out to get those stories, she had all kinds of rituals of approach that basically established a rapport and a relationship before these people would trust her with the stories. And she wanted to bring that to the institution. So if people who work in the cultural sector, libraries, etc., take that and are open to making the changes in institutional practices, that will be a move towards institutional reconciliation. And then just the other day I had another insight, because there was an awful lot of talk about what's happening to land and land back, etc. And I had the same shift in my thinking about holdings. Instead of land just being holdings as in private property, what if we think about it in verb terms? Holding. We are holding. And the relationships of holding land, and there's an implication of trust there. And when you think about the word tenure and tenancy, a tenant and tenancy comes from that. Tenure comes from the Latin, the French word tenir, to hold. So it's not that necessarily foreign. It might be sort of far back in some of the cultures that we come from that we've lost track of. But here's the promise of reconciliation as we open our minds, open our hearts, open our spirits to receive these other ways of thinking and make changes in our institutions and in the way we constitute ourselves even as a country, so that we are together, going down that river of life together in peace and harmony. That's my hope. Thank you for coming and listening to me. And I love how attentive you all were. Thank you for your sympathetic eyes. Who's got a question or comment? Yes, some brave soul here.
So I was going to.
She's got a microphone because they're recording this.
So a couple of sharings or reflections, having worked in several Indigenous communities myself. One of the words you used to share your experience at the beginning when you were letting go was you used resistance to hold back your comments. And I think that's part of the process of our letting ourselves go, when we let ourselves be part of another's experience. And I was impressed by your process of going from a resistance to like a holding back to a holding on, a connection. And the other interesting thing I found was you shared this piece about powerlessness, use that term linked to that time of not knowing. And I think that that's a huge, huge process for each of us to recognize when we're actually allowing ourselves to be in a liminal space or in a not knowing space. It actually takes courage. We're actually stepping more into our power by allowing ourselves not to know and to open and hold space for others who may know or who may know differently and to engage in that connection. So I want to thank you for the power you expressed, actually, even though perhaps at the time you felt you were powerless. I see it as your courage and you're stepping in more into your power, and I support all of us to do the same.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Heather. Great to see you. I was wondering whether in immersing yourself as you have, and I'm so glad to hear the process, and thank you for sharing, whether you found yourself tuning into your own ancestral Indigenous roots as you were doing this process.
Yes.
I think you've written about your Scottish.
Yes.
Your Scottish heritage.
That's right. And I actually think it helped, in a way, it helped prepare the way for me. But I was telling you about this last recording session where I was sitting with Bonnie and Fred, and at the end of it, I found myself saying, I was all choked up. I mean, I was so moved by what they had entrusted me with in terms of sharing their knowledge. And I said, thank you, Miigwech, you've helped me listen to my own ancestors. And at the time, listening to those words come out of my mouth, I didn't know what I meant. And I still don't know. I feel as though my journey is not finished yet, actually. Because I think that one of the things, and I don't know where all of you people come from, but I know I've been able to uncover a heritage in the Highlands of Scotland where I reconnect with the pre-modern, pre-colonial, and pre-capitalist ways of being on the land. And the more people can, if they've got an opportunity to do that, it again helps them to be able to honor and really respect this way of being that continues, has persisted. I was just at Curve Lake Reserve, and they go back thousands of years. in their belonging to the land and relating to the land and all that kind of thing. So to be able to pull and reconnect with what remnants are there gives us a place to stand and helps us to be in solidarity, because I don't think the idea is to become a wannabe Indigenous person. It's to do our own work, which is to decolonize our own minds so that we can take a position that is different and create a counter-narrative. I talk about a settler counter-narrative that we could be part of. And connecting, having a sense of that gives you that kind of, so it's not just, well, what do I do when I've repudiated the colonial history that goes back to, 1867 and stuff like that. Well, there's this other whole area to step into. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
I have a question about reconciliation and repudiation. If we're doing it all in English, I'd like to know about the language that you were hearing and whether there was a sense of other language around you and whether most of what you learned and what you absorbed was in English. I feel a sense of conflict about the fact that our reconciliation will be in our own language.
That's one of the major challenges. There are people trying to learn, settler people, trying to learn Indigenous languages, and certainly the language reclamation that is going on right now is huge. And I think it's really important for people. Somebody asked me the other day about my white privilege, colonial white privilege and all this sort of thing. I think it's possible to be understanding that we are in a position to gift back from our privilege without also taking control. So one can, like I basically brought the privilege of knowing how to write a book and know how to run a tape recorder and knowing how to connect with a publisher. And I put that at their disposal. Now it took me a while to actually walk the talk and stop being this professional writer who knew everything, and truly let them be in charge. And it was really interesting because it was a kind of a shift. Because when I was finally ready to really, really listen, they really took charge. But all of the language that we were speaking English the whole time, and how much there's so much. Like one of the things Marcia told me was that the language is in the stories. The stories, you have to have the language in order to keep the stories alive. And the more you can keep the stories alive, the more you can keep the relevance of reclaiming the language alive. There is so much wisdom in when they talk about things and they unpack some of how they say it in Anishinaabe language. And it makes me want to keep donating wherever it's relevant to support the recovery of language, because many, many languages are on the verge of extinction. And there is so much wisdom lost, so many stories lost, so many connections to the living world that are lost when that happens. One of the poignant moments when I was starting to do the writing I took Marcia for a coffee just before I left for going back to Gabriola, and she had that plastic bag she often carries with her. And I knew enough, don't ask what's in that bag. She'd pull it out, all in good time, and she did. And she handed me this hardbound dictionary, Ojibwe English, Ojibwe. And at the front, it's full of explanations about how the written is honoring the oral. So all the variations in spelling are because of the variations in how things are pronounced. in different areas. Like literally, there's a difference between where they are, which is near Sarnia, and up around Curd Lake. So some of the that explains, for instance, they say Anishinaabe. Up at Curd Lake, they say Anishinaabe. So that's just one example. But what's really beautiful is this dictionary had all these pages that explained about the honoring of the oral. So the oral is still central, even when there was a written text, which I thought was significant. But it was such a beautiful gift and such a token of her trust, I thought, that she gifted that dictionary. She'd gone all the way out and she bought a copy, and it was over $100. So, yeah, I don't know whether that answers your question. It certainly addresses it somewhat. Yes, we've got a...
And then I have a question as well.
Okay.
Luke's question first.
And if there's any questions over here, you know.
So one of the things that I picked up on was when you said you cared. That's when things changed. What was it that made you care?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, she said she picked up on the fact that things began to change for me when I began to care about these people. So she said, what caused you to care about these people? I think I had, it's amazing the role of the imagination. The imagination takes you places and then you follow and your actions fulfill something. So I had this dream of learning to practice what a treaty relationship was all about from an Indigenous point of view, which is that you become kin-like. And it wasn't that I was sort of like, okay, I'm going to turn you into kin. It was that it was not a transactional relationship. It was a personal relationship, even an intimate relationship. So I was setting out to establish a rapport, to make myself worthy of being treated and considered treaty kin. And so in that footing, I mean, the capacity to care comes from the capacity for empathy. And as my need to protect myself against the unfamiliar and all that started to fade away, so my capacity for empathy grew. And I think it's a very natural human thing, and it's one of the reasons why love is at the center of the universe. We are meant to form social bonds with each other, kiss and kin. And what's interesting is that in Anishinaabe language, they categorize people into either relatives or foreigners. And that speaks to, I think, the intimacy that is implicit in Anishinaabe or in many Indigenous relationships. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, I think Brian wants to give you the microphone.
So one of the things I guess the question is, what are the attitudes of colonialism that you had to break down? Because you talked about taking something out of your box. What was in that box that you had to take out in order for you to embrace the people that you were working with?
I think the best way to answer that is to point towards what I was talking about, the power dynamic. The power dynamic of colonialism and white superiority relating to racism and racializing people, because people are people, is the power dynamic operates in a way that I implicitly assume the authority role that creates boxes in the first place. that adjudicates boxes, that puts you into this box and you into that box. So it was understanding how that dynamic worked in me. I mean, I'm used to reading about that, you know, political economy and all these nasty colonial people. But thinking about the because the power dynamic is such as you keep recolonizing. Like, for instance, I was talking about where I used that word occupation. And Marcia said, we were going home, this is a homecoming. Well, if I'd gotten away with putting things like occupation into the book, I'd be in an exercise of recolonization. And a resisting of and a decolonization is to say, no, that's the language that denies the legitimacy of their being home. So that's I have to be aware of that operating within myself and then interrupt it, disrupt it, shut it down. I mean, it still pops up. I mean, I'm recovering. I'm still recovering. But at least I can understand better of how that dynamic works at a very intimate, subtle, almost pre-conscious. That's why I talked about it as a gravitational force here. It's almost pre-conscious. You're doing something before you even realize it, and you don't even think of it as, this is colonial behavior. Until you notice that tightening of the lips. Yes, Brian.
What you just talked about was actually my question.
Oh.
In the sense that some of the work that I've been doing going back to Kenya and dealing with colonialism. And a Kenyan writer talked about decolonizing the mind way back in 1986. And I don't even hear about it or start reading about it until much later in life.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question to you was, you used that phrase several times today, decolonizing the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about it just now a little bit. Are there other ways that you also imagine the task for those of us who have, you used the phrase colonialism is stitched into us.
Mm-hmm.
All those ways that we don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
We live it, but don't understand it, how we live it, or
Absolutely.
unawareness. So I'm just wondering if you sort of touched on one now, and I think a really key one, of that sort of restoring or changing the way that we view things. Would there be others that you observe?
It's not prescriptive. This is the thing. What I hope my book does is kind of model the work that we need to do on ourselves. And it's just one person's journey. And each of you will do your own journey. And in terms of bringing the changed perspective in yourself and your ability to shift your patterns of thinking into a way that is really open and welcoming of others, it's then bringing that into the institutions where you work and operate and all that kind of thing. But there's such subtlety. I mean, just at the level of, because I watched it, I was up in Aurelia and I was engaged in something where there were equal numbers of Indigenous people and white people, and just how the settler types were taking it upon themselves to keep the conversation going. It's just this and it's so subtle. It's not offensive, but you sort of realize it's at that kind of, just to be aware of why am I not just letting the silence be and letting whatever is going to emerge. It's that subtle and that hard to deal with. But once you start to deal with it, then it's easier. And I think the more we can talk, I mean, people, last place I was at, people were talking about they wanted to get a book club set. They wanted to make this book the subject of a book club group reading, because then they could talk and they could tell each other their stories, because I think we want to be doing this together. And the more we can laugh at ourselves, I mean, I don't pull any punches on myself in this book. I mean, I'm just out there, all falling flat on my face, making all the mistakes. And luckily, these people were patient with me. I guess they figured there was something in there worth something. Heather was worth working on. So what came through.
Laura has a question and one more, and then maybe we'll give a chance for more.
Hi, so that was actually something that I was wondering was about therapy and whether or not that was something that, you were open to. Because I find that a lot of people that are deconstructing and writing from their settler perspective, right, are really dealing with issues of their own repression, their own projection, their own defensiveness, and trauma from the past. And I just jotted down, that everyone wants to be validated for who they are. And, sometimes it's easier to look at the other than to look at our own past and who we are. And there is the deflection and perhaps the repression. And in terms of Aboriginal people and their voices, that people don't have to agree with the perspective, but it's really beautiful and nice when people listen to it.
Exactly.
And that we have to ask, do we afford Indigenous people and minorities equality of treatment or opportunity, but not equality of the results?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that this whole thing of letting yourself be, I think is a big part of this. There's a lot of, particularly people who are self-described as progressive. We get ourselves in the trap where, we're so progressive, we're supposed to have it all figured out. And to actually break the silence on the fact that we don't know. That we're making mistakes and we get caught up in defensiveness and resistance and all that. And that's why being in a group is such a useful thing. You touched on the trauma. It's something that I'm continuing to think about. I all along I felt as though I'm not only healing for myself, I'm healing for those great-great-grandparents who came from Scotland. And they had been on commonly shared land, land that spoke to them, land that sustained them, that from which they derived everything, including their identity, and their culture and their stories and their songs and all that. And then they come to this land that doesn't speak to them. And they are fed a whole line of, what they have to do in order to get possession of their property and all that. And so we hear about this rugged pioneer spirit. Well, I'm now thinking about that as stage 1 workaholism. And workaholism, the beginning of workaholism. I describe myself as a recovering workaholic. So the trauma of dislocation. Gabor Mate in his last book talks a lot about trauma and so many of our lives. And he has a chapter in which he talks about the dislocation. But interestingly, he cites somebody called Bruce Alexander, whose work I've used, who specifically talks about dislocation from the land as a reason for addiction, for alcoholism. And he traces it amongst the Scots who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. So I think lifting up the latent trauma that's there to be reckoned with and to be healed is part of the healing journey. When we heal ourselves, then we can heal the relationship. So all the repairing that needs to be done begins at home. So we have a question over here.
I just wanted to say that I started to be workaholic questioned a lot of times. Why am I working for this person? You know, why should I be here every day? It's because I want money, and but I think that's a capitalist or colonial way of thinking about it. But before we came here to be productive and be a tool that makes a product, before that it was, I'm gonna make you shoes, you're gonna make it bread, give me the bread, I'll make you shoes, you know. But now it's money, and I think I just started working for a guy who I really like, and I'm able to see it as I'm helping this person, they're helping me, and we're making a relationship. He invited me to come and play volleyball on Wednesday nights, and I think that's slowly, that's my way of, or that's both of us, the guy and my way to move away from the very structured, boxed-in, financial machine way of the way our world works, and it's a lot easier to live as people who talk to each other and care about each other. So I really like that. This whole conversation, I'm really enjoying it because it's making me realize that thinking about things in less of a, like if you think about people as people and see them as a relationship and not just they can give me money and I do 8 hours of work, and, you know, I think it would actually make a lot of things easier if we started to see the things we do every day as helping each other out and having a relationship. And I think that if we did that the whole way, like along the line from a business owner down to someone who just started out working, a lot of people would be a lot better off because they're seen as people and not just someone who's there, you know. I think productivity and efficiency is all important, but it'll come, it'll happen by itself, and it'll be a lot better if we can just talk, like you said.
Yeah. Focus on the relationship.
Yeah.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, and I just want to say one quick thing, focusing on the relationship. I went back to Stony Point this summer to visit all these people, and I took my son with me. And Bonnie feasted us. We had a barbecue with some other people, and it was palpable how much it meant to them that I would show up with my son. So I just want to end with that. The relationships keep going from one generation to the next, and so we will make a peaceful world, and a world that is at peace with itself. Because then we will find the energy to address some of the fundamental problems of our society. When we know that all we have to focus on is being people, relationships, and the love that binds us. Thank you.
I wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you to you. People already have. Heather and I know each other, have been in a relationship for many years, right? Since through meeting at First United, and so they're just a delight to welcome you back to the Ottawa area, and more importantly, to have opportunity to delve more deeply into your own story, which awakens our stories within ourselves, as all of us are on this journey of reconciliation. And so thank you for opening that up. Thank you for this conversation. I encourage you, I've read about 2/3 of the book, I haven't quite finished it. I'm anxious to get to the end, actually, because you see the unfolding of it. And so I know there are copies of the book here tonight if you would like to have that. Stephen's back there.
Stephen, thank you for coming and selling books. And if anyone wants me to sign their book, that's one of the great pleasures of being a writer, to have people come up, we want to sign it. But I'll go out there, I think, if that's...
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yes,
so there's-
please, yeah, thank you for coming, and anyone who buys a book, wonderful. I hope you enjoy it.
And there's no need to rush away. There's coffee, tea, snacks, and opportunity to chat with Heather one-on-one. And Heather is actually going to be the guest at a First United Church on Sunday morning. And so we are afforded that opportunity in a liturgical sense of experiencing this work as well. All right, thanks.
Oh, can I
everyone.
tell you one more story? This vest is gifted to me by a Anishinaabe, an Ojibwe woman who has been a friend of mine for 20 years here in Ottawa. And she would have been here tonight, but she works shift work as a personal care worker in a long-term care facility. And but she has been walking beside me all this way. She even shared a ceremony when I was beginning so that I could put my tobacco down and ask the Creator, basically give myself over to that. And then one day I showed up here and she'd made me a ribbon skirt and this vest, which is reversible. And her spirit name is Morning Star Woman. And she is a beautiful, and I'm honored to have her as a friend. So I know I carried her spirit with me when I wear this vest. Yeah.
So let us continue to be in community. Thank you very much.
Thank you.